when you look at all of the money we threw into Homeland Security after 9/11, we put a lot of money into new FBI agents, other corners of federal law enforcement. But the pitch there was a very patriotic one. It was, come be the front line of defense, join an elite counter-terror force, be the first line of defense against Al-Qaeda. That's not the hiring pitch that ICE is making right now in social media clips, in Fox News stories, in news headlines. It is, are you someone who gets really excited to dress up like you are storming Fallujah in tactical gear with long guns to go round up some roofers in the Home Depot parking lot?
Hello, and welcome to the Politics Girl podcast. I'm your host, Lee McGowan. Let's get into it. Anyone looking around America right now can see that what's happening with ICE is not only a tremendous waste of money, but a shocking infringement on our constitutional and human rights. To talk about border and immigration enforcement, I am joined today by Garrett Graff, the best-selling historian and Pulitzer Prize finalist who spent nearly 2 decades covering politics, technology, and national security. A former teacher at Georgetown, Garrett is the author of 9 books on topics ranging from presidential campaigns to Watergate, 9/11, and cybersecurity. Garrett is known for using history to explain the story of where we've been to better reflect where we're headed. You can read his work in multiple publications, but he has a regular newsletter called Doomsday Scenario that's really worth checking out. I'm having him on today to really dig into one of his most recent posts, published in Mother Jones, titled, Why Spending $200 Billion on ICE is a Terrible Idea. So without further ado, please welcome my guest, historian, award-winning journalist, and best-selling author, Garrett Graff. Welcome, Garrett.
Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, thanks for coming. I mean, I read this article that you wrote, and I was just like, yeah, that's exactly right. Like, it was just such a clear way of saying it. And I think so many of us don't understand what's going on with ICE except to know what we see through our social media, that it was sort of wonderful to see you break it down why this was such a bad idea. You were saying that there's many reasons why Trump's new domestic agenda, as it's laid out in the Big Beautiful Bill, is going to be such a tragedy for the country. You wrote that not only is it mean-spirited and life-wrecking and community-destroying with all the cuts to our social safety net and healthcare and food assistance, but also that we're doing it for the blatant reason of just giving more tax breaks to the wealthiest, to the people that don't even need it. And you wrote in your article, how cruel do you have to be to raise taxes on people making less than $15,000 a year? Who are you if you're looking at that group of people and thinking like, yeah, those people have it too easy, and it's the billionaires who really need more?
Yeah. I think that this bill is a statement of a whole series of public policy priorities that I don't know why you would get into public service to further. This bill reflects a country that is not the country that I like to believe that America is, that I sort of like to think we are a kinder, nicer, more caring country than the country that shows up in this bill. There has been a lot of evidence over the last 10 years in American politics that I am wrong about the country that we are, but I still in my heart of hearts think that this is not reflective, at least, of the tradition of public service that I think motivates most people who get into government and politics.
And you say that basically, I mean, I'm looking at what's behind you for people that can't see it and are just listening to the pod. You have a Nixon poster, you have a Goldwater poster. Like, you would be, I'm assuming, some sort of a traditional conservative or Republican, and yet you're looking at this same budget when you say, show me your budget and I'll show you my values. And this budget does not match with the values of what we're seeing from this current Republican government.
My Nixon Goldwater is actually a reflection of my time writing about Nixon in a book that I did on Watergate. So
Perfect.
I am not what one would call a traditional conservative, but I grew up in Vermont. I live in Vermont. I worked for Howard Dean when he was governor of Vermont and then when he was running for president. And in most of the rest of the country, in traditional terms, Howard Dean would be a Republican.
Yeah, a classic centrist, right?
A classic centrist. And I think one of the things that I believe in my heart of hearts in politics is that the role of government is to help smooth out the unlucky. that we are all unlucky at various times in our lives. It is one of the few things that we have no control over in our lives, whether it's a health scare, whether it's a family scare, whether it's a community scare, as we've seen in Texas in the last couple of weeks, as we're certainly going to see in some American cities or towns in hurricane season this summer. I've always believed that the role of government is to sort of help the unlucky, assuming that sort of all of us will be unlucky at various times and need that government help. And this is a budget that sort of top to bottom guts most of the parts of government that work hardest to protect the unlucky.
Yeah. And if you are looking out for the unlucky, it's like you're only as strong as your weakest link. And if you're helping the weakest link at that moment, then theoretically you're strengthening the entire nation. But as you point out, as someone who has covered federal law enforcement for the last 2 decades, someone who's written books about the fall of fascism in Europe, it's also impossible to not look at this new piece of legislation and see that not only are we hurting people with these policies, we're turbocharging what will ultimately be a form of a lawless regime with all the money that we're allowing into Border Patrol and ICE. So talk to me about why you wrote this article and what your biggest concerns are about giving a blank check to essentially a giant unchecked secret police.
Yeah. So I've spent most of the last 20 years covering federal law enforcement. I have written books about the FBI. I've written articles about ICE and the postal inspectors and the marshals and ATF and lots of alphabet soup agencies. And I spent about 5 years covering CBP, the Customs and Border Protection, and specifically looking at the wave of corruption, crime, and misconduct that followed a hiring surge that the Border Patrol did in the Bush years post 9/11, in the wake of the original creation of DHS. That agency sort of tried to double from about 9,000 Border Patrol agents to about 18,000 in a very short period of time. And how what ended up happening was the agency was just swamped by misconduct, crime, corruption of a whole lot of people who should have never been federal law enforcement officers. And I'll come back to that in a second. But to then pivot to the modern moment, this new spending legislation this summer puts about $200 billion into immigration enforcement. That includes money to hire about 10,000 new ICE detention officers, as well as about $40 billion for new detention facilities, $50 billion for border security.
So it's personal enforcement, but it's also money for detention and surveillance. They want money to build more walls, more prisons, and to put more immigration agents out in the street, more ICE agents out in the streets to basically round people up and or terrify us into behaving the way they want us to.
Yeah. And I think it's really easy in sort of politics to like throw around these really large numbers with millions and billions and like to not have people really understand what those numbers really mean. To put that $200 billion in context, ICE's annual budget right now is about $10 billion. We are going to be funding ICE at a level that is larger than the combined budgets of the FBI, the ATF, the DEA, and the Federal Bureau of Prisons, again, combined. So we are going to be funding ICE not at the level of a federal law enforcement agency, but we're going to be funding it effectively at the level that we fund the U.S. Marine Corps, like an actual pillar of the armed services.
Yeah, I think they said if ICE were the military unto itself, it would now be the 6th largest military budget in the world.
Something in that range.
In the world.
Yeah. And coming back to the CBP example, the challenge is no healthy law enforcement agency can grow at the scale and scope and speed that ICE is apparently going to attempt to grow. ICE is not a healthy law enforcement agency to begin with, for all of the ways that you can see on your social media accounts and daily news headlines right now. Every police agency, state, local, federal, that has ever tried to grow at this scale and speed has failed. And the examples are notorious across the history of American criminal justice. Miami in the 1980s, which tried to vastly increase its police force. You can talk about the infamous class of 1989 of the Metropolitan Police Department in Washington, D.C., where Mayor Marion Barry tried to increase the size of the local police by 50% in a single year. And what ends up happening is you have this like long trailing arc, this long tail of crime and corruption that follows these officers, because in order to grow at this scale, you cut your education standards, you cut your hiring standards, you cut your oversight standards, you cut your supervision and training standards. And that's exactly what ended up happening with CBP. CBP, sister agency to ICE, like we don't have to look very far for examples of how this goes wrong. Doubles in size, again, 9,000 to 18,000 agents. And what that ends up meaning is that from 2005 to 2012, there are 2,100 CBP officers and agents arrested themselves for crime and misconduct, which means that for 7 years, one CBP officer or agent was arrested every single day. And by as late as 2017, more than a decade after the hiring surge started, the pace of arrest for crime, corruption, and misconduct among CBP had slowed to only one agent or officer every 36 hours. So like this was still a like titanic tidal wave of crime and corruption within the ranks of the own Border Patrol that they are sort of still trying to sort out today.
What Garrett is saying is when you try to supersize an agency, when you try to hire people this fast, history shows us, based on Garrett's research, that when any law enforcement agency grows too fast, their hiring standards fall, they limit their training, the officers end up being inexperienced, the supervisors don't know what they're doing. You know, people who are supposed to be familiar with the procedures don't know them, so they end up making a lot of mistakes. And law enforcement usually regrets that speed in which they hired people because the mistakes that are made during that time often take years to fix. I mean, you told a story in your article about how Border Patrol tried to increase their hiring, and they ended up with a bunch of cartel members and even like one serial killer in the mix, and they put them on patrol.
Yes. This isn't just about the new officers coming in that's the problem. It's also that it sort of corrupts and breaks the whole organization, because in order to bring on these new officers, what ends up happening is you end up promoting the current officers into sort of levels of supervision and executive ranks that they're not qualified for either, that they haven't had the field experience, they haven't had the training for, they haven't had the sort of supervision in order to do those jobs well. And so then you sort of end up with this like whole house of cards where across the entire organization, no one is qualified, no one has the training, no one has the supervision. And again, that's in your healthiest law enforcement agencies. What sort of specifically terrifies me about throwing this amount of money at ICE is we already can see that ICE is not a healthy law enforcement agency. That sort of the speed with which it has moved towards masked, unmarked law enforcement operations, enforcement operations, the speed with which they have resorted to sort of brutal tactics. And then also think about who this is going to attract as the next generation of this turbocharged ICE agent.
Yeah. You laid out 4 major reasons we should be deeply worried about what the Trump administration is doing with immigration. And you're starting right now with saying, like, listen, no one is supposed to supersize a law enforcement agency this fast. That's rule number 1, because we know it goes badly. We know the mistakes are made. We know we hire the wrong people, promote the wrong people, and they're already making mistakes. If you add that many more people in, what will happen? And the second one that you're going on to now, which I think is like, who does this then attract to be these officers? That would be the second one. 3, you talk about the funding disparity between ICE and Border Patrol and how much bigger their budget is going to be now than the Justice Department. And the Justice Department is supposed to be a very big part of this. There's supposed to be a whole process through the courts that we work through, but they're putting all the money into enforcement rather than the legal system that should go hand in hand with it. And then finally, if we're not prioritizing the law, because we're not putting money into the Justice Department or new immigration judges per se, we're putting it all into law enforcement, it's a really bad time for the Supreme Court to be turning a blind eye to the lawless behavior of the executive branch. So that's kind of the four main pillars. And you and I were just discussing this idea that like ICE shouldn't be growing that fast because really no agency should be growing that fast. But then you're talking about now, who wants to be an ICE agent right now, right? Like, who's drawn to this job when we know it has like a social stigma to it and a sort of political nature to the brand itself? Have you ever tried to buy wine, but you have no idea what to get? There's just too much to choose from. You stand there looking at a giant wall until you end up with the same 3 bottles of wine you already know. That's why I'm so excited for our new sponsor, Naked Wines. Naked Wines is a wine club that directly connects you with the world's best independent winemakers so you can get world-class wine delivered straight to your door. Naked Wine brings you amazing wine straight from the winery for up to 60% less than you would pay in the store. By cutting out the extra costs like middleman markups, winemakers can pass the savings on to you without skimping on quality. The company has been around for 15 years and it backs over 90 independent winemakers around the world to make wine you love to drink. For my first order, I filled out a form to explain the kind of wine I liked, the kind of wine I didn't like, what I was looking for, how many bottles of each I wanted, and they did the work for me. It was so easy and all the wines were so good. Nothing says summer like a good bottle of chilled rosé. Nothing makes you a better guest than showing up with a quality bottle of white. So join me in the Naked Wine community. Head to nakedwines.com/politicsgirl and click enter voucher and put in my code politicsgirl. If you put in both the code and the password, you're going to get 6 bottles of wine for just $39.99 with shipping included. That's $100 off your first 6 bottles at nakedwines.com/politicsgirl and use the code and password politicsgirl for 6 bottles of wine for $39.99. Here's a couple that I ordered. And I would show you more, but honestly, I drank them. Sorry. So I just renewed my vows for my 20th wedding anniversary. And I have to say, I don't think I look so bad for my age. One compliment I always get, though, is about how thick my hair is. I was blessed with big hair. But if you weren't, or if you find your hair thinning as you get older, you might want to check out OneSkin Scalp Serum, OS1 Hair. I've been talking about OneSkin products for a long time because OneSkin was founded by an all-woman team of scientists with PhDs in skin regeneration, stem cell biology, immunology, and bioinformatics. After testing the efficiency of more than 900 so-called anti-aging peptides, the women developed the OS1 peptide, the first ingredient to reverse the skin's biological age by reducing the accumulation of senescent cells, the key driver of skin aging. Now they have a product that people are raving about for your hair, the OS1 peptide that powers their skin and sun care they are now using to target age-related hair loss. People are finding their hair thicker and fuller, their scalp healthier. They are seeing new baby hairs at their hairline. And it's not just talk. OneSkin scientists did a clinical study that showed that after 6 months, participants had significantly thicker and denser hair. So if you're ready to give OS1 hair a try, now is the time. OneSkin is the world's first skin longevity company. By focusing on the cellular aspects of aging, OneSkin keeps your skin looking and acting younger for longer. For a limited time, you can try OneSkin with 15% off by using the code politicsgirl at oneskin.co. That's 15% off at oneskin.co with the code politicsgirl. And after you purchase, when they ask where you heard about them, please support the show and tell them that we sent you. Because everyone deserves thicker, more luxurious hair. Who wants to be an ICE agent right now, right? Like, who's drawn to this job when we know it has like a social stigma to it and a sort of political nature to the brand itself?
Yeah, and I think that, like, after 9/11, when you look at all of the money we threw into Homeland Security after 9/11, we put a lot of money into new FBI agents, other corners of federal law enforcement. But the pitch there was a very patriotic one. It was, come be the front line of defense, join an elite counter-terror force, be the first line of defense against Al-Qaeda. That's not the hiring pitch that ICE is making right now in social media clips, in Fox News stories, in news headlines. It is, are you someone who gets really excited to dress up like you are storming Fallujah in tactical gear with long guns to go round up some roofers in the Home Depot parking lot? Are you watching the news and are excited to like scuffle with Democratic members of Congress who are trying to do their legal constitutional duty to provide oversight of detention facilities? Do you get your rocks off like beating up America's abuelas outside of churches and schoolyards and, shipping them off to South Sudan or El Salvador torture gulags? I mean, this is, I think, a recruiting pitch for America's worst bullies. I think sort of unfortunately, The Onion covers politics more accurately than a lot of political outlets these days. And there was an Onion headline last week about every trait that made an ICE applicant bad for every other job makes them perfect to be hired by ICE right now.
Like xenophobic, racist, sadist, bully, incompetent, unprepared, like all these things
Right.
Might be an asset in ICE.
Exactly. We've never seen a hiring surge in a law enforcement agency that was so polarized, so partisan, had such a sort of loss of legitimacy in a free and democratic society. In a free, democratic, open society, policing requires the permission of the policed. Like, that is one of the sort of fundamental tenets of policing dating back to Sir Robert Peel founding the London Metropolitan Police in the 1800s as the first modern police force. Like, the reason that police have authority is that we, the policed, respect them. What ICE has lost in the last 6 months, which ICE had for most of the 19 and a half years of its existence prior to January 20th, 2025, is the sort of basic public legitimacy that we appreciated their work. And now we're seeing, this split between ICE and, the American population in a way that we've never really seen at a like national or societal level in American policing. There are certainly like communities or neighborhoods that have bad relationships with their local police departments. That's nothing like the idea that we're now seeing, federal law enforcement jeered at sporting events.
Yeah, well, it's hard to respect masked men in unmarked cars with no identification who can do whatever they want. And I don't know if you're doing that job or not. Like, if that's you, you're not the good guy. It literally doesn't matter if your paycheck is signed by the US government. You're not the good guy. If you show up somewhere, don't tell anyone where you are, you're masked, and you throw people into cars and don't answer any questions. That does not make you the good guy. It doesn't matter who's paying your salary. And I think we have to remember, too, that they've talked about giving these new recruits just extraordinary bonuses and extraordinary paychecks. They're talking about paying off their student loans and giving them federal universal health care. And it's kind of one of those things where it's like they're going to make it almost impossible for people not to take the job, but also to leave the job, even if they see things that they shouldn't be seeing, because where else are they going to get that kind of paycheck, that kind of bonuses, that kind of extras, perks? You're not getting that anywhere, especially in a job that has no education requirement.
Exactly. And that's where, again, like part of the challenge of this is ICE already has among the lowest hiring standards, education standards, and training standards of any federal law enforcement agency. ICE today, right now, is the best educated and trained and most mature ICE we will see for the next decade, which is a terrifying sort of thought for American society.
Yeah, it's like that old Simpsons thing where it was like, this is the worst day of my life. And he's like, so far.
Right.
Like that's what it's like. This is the worst ICE has ever been. You're like, so far. I mean, the thing is that I think one of the problems, and you wrote about it in your article, is that the culture that we're seeing play out in ICE, the people that are attracted to it, this group clearly believes they're never going to face any kind of accountability, right? So they are attracting that kind of person. They are then behaving like no one's ever going to hold them accountable for what they do. And that is a problem unto itself.
Yeah, and I think it is indicative of the unhealthy culture that sort of underlies this, which is there are plenty of federal law enforcement agencies that operate in plain clothes. The FBI, ATF, Secret Service, U.S. Marshals.
But we've been seeing those guys on TV show us their badges since the dawn of time.
Right. And so what you see is that those agencies, and part of the poison of Donald Trump politics is it makes you into an apologist for things that you don't actually mean to be an apologist for. So I am far from an FBI apologist in my normal hat. But for a moment, let me talk about sort of how wonderful the FBI is as an agency, which is when the FBI is doing an enforcement operation, they go out of their way to make clear that they're federal law enforcement. They have those iconic blue FBI raid jackets with the bright yellow FBI letters on the back. Same with DEA, same with ATF. And sort of the whole point is when a team of FBI agents arrives on your doorstep, you are never going to confuse them with anyone else.
Like with a home invasion.
Right.
Right.
And ICE has gone in the absolute opposite direction, where in just a matter of months, they have adopted these sort of masked, unmarked enforcement tactics that really are terrifying for a free and open society like the United States. Like, we have never been a country where sort of a state officer can come up to you on the street and demand your papers and sort of tell you whether it's okay for you to go down to the corner store.
Yeah, no, that's antithetical to American freedom. It's what people would never expect to happen here. It's something that happened in 1930s Germany, the show us your papers on the train kind of stuff.
Exactly.
But we're now living in Donald Trump's America, but Stephen Miller's vision, right? And Stephen Miller's version of America is completely different than what we see in our constitutionally protected America.
Yeah. And, I'm, for the listeners who can't tell this, I'm a very white guy. And I don't think I probably have to worry too much yet about carrying my passport with me when I go down to my grocery store. But there are a lot of Americans who are, by any definition American, who don't look like me, who I think in this next phase of ICE's growth and turbocharging are going to feel like they need to be carrying their birth certificates and passports anytime that they're leaving the house.
Yeah, I think that we forget that a lot of these agencies that we're dealing with now haven't been around for that long. They're not built into our system. They are a result of reaction to 9/11. The Department of Homeland Security was never designed to handle all of this. There's supposed to be a lot of people involved, including immigration courts and the Department of Justice. Stephen Miller's talking about deporting 3,000 people a day. He's saying that he thinks the country should only have 100 million people. We currently have 300 million people, right? That isn't something you just say and then try and accomplish. The Justice Department is supposed to be deeply involved. They should have an equal budget, but there's no way they're going to be able to keep up with the way the budget has been set up now. It's not even realistic to think about processing that many deportations daily. So then you start thinking about the human cost of that. I mean, obviously due process is going to take a hit, but also legal oversight, that kind of thing. And so I think people need to remember that it's not just well, these are my rights. And your rights might not make it into this new iteration of what they're trying to do.
Yeah, and it's a huge change in who is getting deported, who is getting targeted by these raids. For most of ICE's existence, it has operated with what was known and was codified in a series of policy memos with what was known as prosecutorial discretion, which is sort of a fancy way of saying ICE tried to be smart about who it targeted. ICE has a limited number of officers that, everyone has a limited number of hours in the day. And on any given day, there are more people in the country illegally than ICE can arrest and deport. So what ICE focused on, and again, I'm not saying ICE was absolutely perfect for the last 19 and a half years. I'm not saying that this accounted for 100% of their cases, but it accounted for the main drive of the agency, was to go after people who were not simply criminals because they were here, but people who were doing crimes here in the United States.
Which is also what Donald Trump said they were going to look for.
Right.
Because if you're here overstaying your visa, that's a civil case. He said they're going to go after the worst of the worst, the gang members, the rapists, the murderers. And they went immediately to immigration courts and picked up people that were doing it genuinely the legal way.
Exactly. And the difference is that ICE really did target the, quote unquote, bad criminals for most of its existence. But that work is really resource intensive. You have to identify them. It takes a lot of officers to sort of find them and launch the raid to arrest them. You're dealing with actually violent people. And so you need to sort of have a different scale and posture for the raid and different level of organization. When Stephen Miller showed up at ICE headquarters and decreed this sort of magical, we need to arrest 3,000 people a day number, what that meant was ICE has to go after the abuelas, that ICE sort of has to go after the easiest, lowest hanging fruit in America. And that's when you sort of started to see this huge shift in May towards the SWAT teams raiding Home Depot parking lots and, rounding up migrant workers on farms and, arresting people in immigration courts and schools and churchyards. I watched a horrific video of, dad getting arrested dropping his kid at daycare today.
Yeah, it's a terrible video. And if anyone hasn't seen it, they just take him away and they leave the kid in the car. And they've done that multiple times.
And you just coming back a little bit to where our conversation started, I don't understand how ICE officers who are doing this are going home feeling good about their contribution to America's security and America's society at the end of the day. We're watching, thousands of people get arrested per day who are not making America any safer and are, in fact, ripping the hearts out of many communities, around the country.
Not to mention financially ripping the heart out of the country. I find that so crazy. We have to remember that as we round up all these immigrants, there's going to be major economic fallout, like labor shortages and loss of tax revenue. And ultimately we could be, destroying our own GDP, increasing the deficit with these giant ICE budgets and just basically messing up our entire lives with the uncertainty that it adds to it. So it's not only morally wrong, it feels financially foolish to be doing it the way they're doing it.
Yeah, immigration has always been controversial in American history, but it has also always been our greatest source of strength. And one of the things that I think make clear the racism and xenophobia that drives Stephen Miller's agenda in this is he is not just trying to shut down illegal immigration. He is also going after legal immigration. He is actually also going after the students trying to study at universities here. He is also trying to go after the scientists and researchers who are coming here to set up their labs and do work and launch startups.
Yeah, that gentleman from the video you were talking about, if it's the same one I'm thinking of, he's a major doctor in the community. And it's we're not going to have these people that come and give their skills to this nation if this is how they're going to be treated by the government.
Yep. What you see day by day in this moment is the sort of fig leaves being ripped off the talking points around immigration, such that we see that at its core, this is a white nationalist, white supremacist agenda being advanced now by the full weight of a federal law enforcement agency.
Yeah, I don't think we can look at it any other way. I mean, if even just to look at who they're hiring, like we were saying before, 10 to 20 times the amount of ICE officers to bring people in, but they're only adding 100 judges to immigration courts, right? So that's impossible. We already have a backlog of people going through the system properly. They want to capture people, which seems to be far more important, but then not give those same people their due rights, their civil rights, their due process because they're not hiring. It's such a number disparity between the officers and the judges, right? And there's also supposed to be this separation between the Attorney General, who's currently Pam Bondi, and the Department of Homeland Security, which is currently run by Kristi Noem. But both those women clearly work directly for the president, and the president just does whatever Stephen Miller tells him to when it comes to immigration. So really, there's no checks and balances on this whole group. And I think we really have to point out that you're saying, like, we can't just be doing this at the same time that the Supreme Court has given this administration an appallingly wide berth when it comes to what he wants to do. Like, as long as we call it a national security issue, he can kind of pick and choose what laws apply to him, right? Like, we can ship people off to, like you were saying, Sudan or El Salvador. That's illogical, right? Those people have never been there before. Why would we do that, right? Like, that doesn't make any sense. And then there's this whole group of people, the ICE agents included, who can just ignore federal law if the president says they can, because the Supreme Court told him he could. And I think that should concern all of us.
Yeah. And Lee, you actually said a really important thing in there, which I want to sort of unpack for a moment, which is what has also become clear in the last 2 months is the extent to which this is Stephen Miller driving it and not Donald Trump. That actually
100%.
Donald Trump is not the one in charge of this. And we saw this in a really interesting way that I think most Americans sort of skipped over, where 6 weeks ago, 2 months ago, as these large scale raids started, Brooke Rollins, who's the agriculture secretary, talked to Donald Trump and said, hey, look, these workplace raids are devastating hospitality, they're devastating farms, they're devastating construction sectors. There's a lot of sectors that are really feeling a big chill from this. And Donald Trump said, you're right. We're going after a lot of people who are not violent. He made a public announcement that, we're going to sort of we're going to scale back the workplace enforcement. Actual policy went out in the field to ICE officers saying stand down on workplace enforcement. And then Stephen Miller, within a couple of hours, within a day or two, basically said, hey, the president's not in charge of this policy. I'm the one in charge of this policy. And I say we are going after these workplace raids. And ICE actually revoked the policy guidance that had gone out to officers, leading Donald Trump at his 4th of July rally in Iowa to sort of again say, hey, I think we're going to try to look at this differently. And, Brooke Rollins says, we need to be smarter about this and figure out how we can keep the workers on the farms. And just nothing came of it.
And then he went into that whole thing about slavery and how the people who own the farms can take responsibility for their workers. And it all started sounding very slavery-esque.
Yes.
But that's Donald Trump talking off the cuff. And I think what we're both saying here is that Donald Trump can say whatever he wants to say. The person running this show is Stephen Miller, and his hired muscle is Tom Homan. And they are both sadists when it comes to immigration, immigrants, people who don't look like you and me. And I think we should, point out that it doesn't matter if Trump's in charge. These are not his necessarily immigration policies. They are the immigration policies that are happening under him. And the success of it is going to be dependent on who follows through, but also on the popularity of it. And I would say the immigration policy popularity is definitely already waning. If I look at the numbers, well over half of America now opposes this level of deportation. The public sentiment in favor of immigration itself is going up rather than down. People do not like ICE agents. So how does the administration square public sentiment with what they're planning to do? Or they just plan to ignore us on all fronts? Because that's what it feels like. I'm really excited about this new sponsor because I love a certain meal prep organization, but I don't always have time to cook them. I order 3 times a week, but that leaves me with 4 extra nights and very little time. This is why I'm excited to try Cook Unity. Cook Unity meals are delivered fully prepared. They are ready-to-eat meals delivered directly to your door from a roster of all-star chefs, including Food Network alumni, James Beard Award winners, and acclaimed restaurateurs. Cook Unity's platform is simple to use, and you can filter by chef, by protein, cuisine, or dietary needs. I personally wouldn't mind losing a little weight going into the new school year, and I think Cook Unity's community is going to be very helpful with that. All meals are created in small batches, take as little as 5 minutes in the oven or microwave to cook, and they are ready to go. So get what you're craving. Try the freshest, best-tasting meal delivery service made by your favorite celebrity chefs. Go to cookunity.com/politicsgirlfree or enter the code politicsgirlfree before checkout for free premium meals for life. That's free premium meals for life by using the code politicsgirlfree or going to cookunity.com/politicsgirlfree. That's countless global cuisines from 160 award-winning chefs delivered right to your door and ready in minutes at cookunity.com/politicsgirlfree. Terms and conditions apply. Go to cookunity.com for details. Right now, the headlines are packed with data breaches and regulatory rollbacks and phishing expeditions that make us all vulnerable. But you can do something about it. Delete Me is here to make it easy, quick, and safe to remove your personal data online. The fact of the matter is, we're all at risk. How many times have you gotten a text or an email or a letter saying your data has been breached? It's very upsetting. But the good news is Delete Me can help. Delete Me does all of the hard work of wiping you and your family's personal information from data broker websites. Sign up and provide Delete Me with exactly what information you want deleted, and their experts take it from there. Delete Me then sends you regular, personalized privacy reports showing you what they found, where they found it, and what they removed. Delete Me is constantly working for you, monitoring and removing your personal information that you don't want on the internet, and it is not some sort of one-time service. As someone with a very active online presence, privacy is incredibly important to me. You hear these stories about hackers obtaining the names and addresses and phone numbers and family member names of people. I'm just very grateful that there's groups like Delete Me available to help keep our information off these sites and keep it from falling into the wrong hands. So take control of your data and keep your private life private by signing up for Delete Me, now at a special discount for our listeners. Get 20% off your Delete Me plan when you go to joindeleteme.com/politicsgirl and use the promo code politicsgirl at checkout. The only way to get 20% off is to go to joindeleteme.com/politicsgirl and enter the code politicsgirl at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/politicsgirl. Code politicsgirl. So how does the administration square public sentiment with what they're planning to do? Or they just plan to ignore us on all fronts? Because that's what it feels like.
Yeah, I think you're right, which is this is a administration that sort of doesn't care about public opinion.
Which is concerning, right? Because you're like, there should be an election in 26. Like, why don't they care that we hate what they're doing?
And that this is a president that is not bound by the normal set of constraints and checks and balances in a political system, from Congress, from the courts, that would provide a meaningful check on some of these excesses. I think one of the things, again, that worries me about the culture of ICE is it is a young agency, and so has not been through these sort of pendulum swings of American politics before. One of the reasons you wouldn't see the FBI, again, not me saying the FBI is a perfect agency for 100 years, et cetera, but
Garrett, you're like, I'm not an FBI apologist. Yeah. Let me say that up front. However,
one of the reasons it's a lot harder to get an agency like the FBI to do corrupt and unconstitutional things is the agents and executives in that agency have sort of lived through scandals before. And so they know, like, the people who are out of power right now might be back in power in the future. And I don't want to be the one in the congressional hearing in 2 years or 4 years whose career is ruined over this set of decisions. ICE is not acting like that. One of the reasons that other federal law enforcement agencies don't rough up the minority members of Congress on a routine basis in the streets of America is because those agencies are like, these guys might be the ones who are in charge next time of our budget. And like, I don't want to, like, one of my agents to have personally punched the head of the House Judiciary Committee or, the head of the Homeland Security Committee in a couple of years. ICE seems totally willing to do that because ICE is acting as if they will never be accountable to ordinary checks and balances in a constitutional system ever again.
Yeah. And that is seriously problematic. I mean, I think about Tom Homan saying, you think we're arresting people now? Wait till we get the funding to do what we want to do, And I think it's terrible. And I think that most people can see that it's terrible. And I think we have to keep our eyes on it and a light on it. And I think we have to shame ICE officers. I mean, you called ICE a masked monster. And then I'm going to quote you. You said, ICE is a masked monster, one uniquely unsuited for its new power, authority, reach, and funding levels. And I think that that's the gist of it all. Like, they are not prepared for this. They do not have the expertise for this. They do not have the training for this. And they don't have any sort of historic background to lead them to know anything about this. It's just a brand new group of shiny green people who really hate everybody. And they're going to show you with their fists and their money now behind them, and they think they'll be accountable to no one. Now, listen, this is depressing, and I agree with you. And I think we need to keep our eye on it, and we need to be really vocal about how we feel about both the agency and how we are dealing with immigration right now. But before you go, I really did just want to ask you about your newest project, because you do so much deep research on things, and you have a way of putting things together so that we understand the bigger picture. And you have a podcast that's a narrative podcast. It's a big award-winning podcast called Long Shadow. You drop it once a year. It's a limited release. This season, you're doing a deep dive into the rise and fall of the internet and social media, and how this tool that was supposed to be bringing us together is really driving us apart. And I think in many ways it's so important right now, because if we're talking about ICE, it's the internet that's going to keep us informed about what these agents are doing. So in some ways we need that kind of thing, but we can also see how it's made us hate each other, how it's made us fight with each other, how it's spread disinformation. Now, I know the podcast is only 7 episodes, and the one that's recent is actually about the Russia attacks on the 2016 election. So good on you. We're right back there in the news. But tell us a little bit about Long Shadow before you go, because I think my audience would get a lot out of it.
Sure. So every season for Long Shadow, we tried to take a sort of public policy or political issue and explain why America is the way that it is today. So, for instance, in the second season, we did the rise of the American far right and sort of tried to show the white nationalist roots of our current politics dating back to the bombing in Oklahoma City, the siege in Waco, Ruby Ridge, and earlier. And then last year we did gun violence and gun policy in America and sort of how America became a country of mass shootings.
Yeah, where are our Second Amendment warriors now? I mean, weren't they supposed to rise up against a tyrannical government? Like, I am waiting.
Yes. Another good Onion headline of late, NRA forgets to rise up against tyrannical government.
Yeah, exactly right.
And so for this season, exactly as you said, we're diving into really the last 35 years of the rise of the internet and social media, which is a story I've lived a lot sort of personally in my career as a journalist in new media outlets. I remember this sort of age in the 2000s of sort of the arrival of social media, the arrival of blogs, the first years of Twitter, the first years of Facebook, and this sort of idea that the internet was going to deliver this amazing era of transparency and accountability, that, democracy was going to win because, authoritarian regimes could never stand up to, the power of the people organized online. And that was a big part of Barack Obama's message and the sort of hope and change and optimism of that era. It was a big part of the Arab Spring in the early years, Twitter and Facebook revolutions in the Middle East. And then over the course of the 2010s, we saw the internet change, and we saw this sort of much darker moment. And now we have seen this sort of tool that was supposed to bring us together and deliver sort of unparalleled access to the world's information really become this unbelievable cesspool of racism and misogyny and hate and harassment and polarization. And so we wanted to try to figure out why that happened. And so across these 7 episodes, we trace year to year, moment to moment, the sort of major moments of this. What really surprised me in the course of this was the internet that we ended up with today is actually a very specific set of very deliberate choices by social media companies in sort of specific and identifiable moments. They chose very consciously polarization over harmony.
They chose profit over everything.
Exactly. Because what it turns out is polarization is far more profitable than harmony. And you see this actually in the algorithms that power our news feeds, sort of et cetera, et cetera. And at one point, Facebook had its dislike button ranked 5 times as powerfully as the like button. So, sort of the angrier you were with something, the more you saw other things that made you even angrier. And that becomes actually a major part of the backdrop of how we ended up with where we are right now.
Not to mention we have, the internet came on us with very little regulation. So we weren't ready to regulate these industries the way we did with, say, news channels and that kind of thing back in the day. Even cable news isn't regulated the way it should be. And it allows disinformation and misinformation to travel so quickly with no one holding it back. We lost the fairness doctrine, we lost slander laws in many ways, and it allowed the internet just supersized all of that. And this thing that was supposed to, as you said, I remember when Facebook came out, it was supposed to connect us. It was a way for me to be friends with all my friends who were living all around the world. And wouldn't this be wonderful? And now, I get 5 or 6 death threats a day. You know what I mean? And so that seems like we've made a mistake somewhere. But as you're saying, it's not a mistake. It's a deliberate choice by the people that ran these agencies of what they were going to promote, what they were going to push, what they were going to highlight, because at the end of the day, the profit was the goal. And now we're seeing power is the goal. That's why we saw all those people who run these social media industries behind Donald Trump at the inauguration. It's all profit and power are kind of the driving force there.
Yep. And you are talking exactly where the season ends in 2 weeks in our 7th episode, where that inauguration is a major scene. And I encourage your listeners to go back and start with episode 1 and sort of follow us along. But these next couple of episodes, episode 6 looks at 2020, sort of how America lost its mind across COVID and the George Floyd protests on into January 6th. And then the final episode really looks at Gamergate and the rise of the manosphere and the rise of Elon.
Yeah. I actually think 2020 might have been our tipping point and we went the wrong way. I want to thank you so much for joining us today, Garrett. I know this isn't good news, but I do think it's important news, and it's important that we know and we're aware of it. I might have to go back and listen to the 2nd season of your thing. I need to know more about white supremacy and the rise of it, I think, especially when we look the way we do. I think it's our responsibility to stand up to it more than anybody else's. Tell people how they can follow you and your work moving forward.
So you can find Long Shadow anywhere that you listen to your podcasts. My newsletter is doomsdayscenario.co. You can find me on Blue Sky or Facebook or LinkedIn or wherever you like to find your stuff as Vermont GMG.
Thank you so much for coming, Garrett. I really appreciate your insight.
My pleasure. This was really great.
So that was Garrett Graff, reminding us that the role of the government should be to help smooth out the world for the unlucky. But this new budget tells us that not only does this administration not care about the unlucky, they are willing to prey on them if it forwards their agenda of bigger tax cuts for the rich and whiter people for the pews. At the end of the day, supersizing our immigration enforcement, surveillance, and detention centers, but not our immigration courts, tell us everything we need to know. This isn't about justice, it's about preference, particularly Stephen Miller's preference. And we are giving an untrained juvenile agency an unlimited blank check to make it happen. I want to thank Garrett for joining us today, and you for caring enough about this country to be here. I know this information is distressing, but the more we know, the better equipped we are to fight back. Until next week, PGM. Before you go, I just want to thank the premium members of this podcast for their support and to encourage non-members to join us. The independent media space is where real information comes from now. This is where the truth is, and we are working really hard against some really destructive forces out there who want to bring you only propaganda. So if you aren't a member of Politics Girl Premium, please go to politicsgirl.com and sign up. You will get this podcast ad-free, along with my rants and bonus content sent directly to your inbox. So even if my work is silenced on social media, you will still get access to the truth. There is a link to sign up in the bio of this episode, but also at politicsgirl.com. And as always, please like and share these podcasts so we can grow the audience. The more people who have access to real information, the more effective we can be at defeating what's going on. As always, thank you for your time and support. The Politics Girl podcast is written and performed by me, Lee McGowan, and produced and edited by Happy Warrior Entertainment. All rights reserved.